Question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to see you there in the chair, ruling over this parliament with an iron fist. Deputy Speaker, it's a good opportunity to get up and speak not just about the issue at hand around the Treasury Laws Amendment, making sure foreign investors pay their fair share of tax in Australia and other measures, Bill 2018, an Income Tax Managed Investment Trust Withholding Tax Amendment Bill 2018, but an opportunity to talk about the broader challenges in which it sits upon. And I pick up from where the previous speaker made reference to the challenge of tax reform, but he seemed to be mostly focused on corporate tax reform and, of course, seeking to target and demonise some sectors of the economy rather than actually looking at an even bigger picture about the task and challenge that we confront. Deputy Speaker, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, despite his wanting to make it self-referential, yes, the Economics Committee is currently completing an inquiry into the implications of removing refundable franking credits, but it is not actually an investigation into opposition policy. It's not an investigation into or inquiry into the issue and the opportunity to have a dialogue and a discussion about the challenges of dividend imputation, the structure of retirement planning, and, of course, how the tax system can seek to advantage some, not others, and critically, when, at what point and at what stage of people's lives they should make contributions to the tax system, when they should get deductions, when they should not. And, of course, it's a simple point, but it seems to be completely oblivious to those on the other side of the chamber. A franking credit is a tax credit reflecting tax paid. Remove the tax credit, only tax is paid, which is why people like myself talk about Labor's retirement tax and what it is going to do for 1 million Australian retirees who are going to have their overpaid tax stolen from them should there be a change of government. And the impact of this, by the way, is very real. Very real. We've heard witness statement after witness statement, testimony after testimony, going specifically through the examples that people experience and what that means for them and their lived experience. Now, I know that isn't the core focus of this bill, but it is part of the tax system and the challenges that we face. In fact, one of the most interesting things, Deputy Speaker, when you talk about these issues with the people affected by dividend imputation and refundable franking credits is how many of them say, actually, what we really want is comprehensive tax reform, and we recognise that there's got to be a change in system and structure. People talk regularly about the challenges faced around corporate taxation, whether it's sufficient and whether it meets the expectations of the Australian community, whether the tax revenue that's collected is sufficient, whether people are using loopholes or privileges to minimise their tax obligation, but also go through, of course, why they feel they're being targeted if they simply get rid of removing refundable franking credits. And I've got many of them here. I mean, they're witness statements and examples of people who have serious issues as a consequence, and some of them quite difficult. I mean, one of the fellows— Sorry? And the classic example, and it's actually quite disappointing, the Deputy Chair of the committee is deriding the witness testimony of people like Chris Sparks, and he was at the Merimbula hearing and heard it directly on the 4th of February 2019. And his statement said, "Thank you, committee. My name is Chris Sparks. I live in Callaroo and I'm here today with my wife, Wendy. Those astute members of you will note that I sit in front of you today in a wheelchair, a very stylish, custom-made, ultralight wheelchair. That's because I was injured when I was 3 years old and had a spinal cord injury. In spite of my injury, I've been lucky enough to work in open employment since the age of 19. I'm now 59, and I'm moving into my latter years and retiring. I worked initially in the world of information technology and went on to run small and large businesses. I ran a corporate entity for a US company in Australia and Asia. I've led a great life. The sad reality, though, of ageing with a spinal cord injury, particularly when you've had one for as long as me, is you can add 10 years to your life. So at 59, I probably have the abilities to get around of a 69-year-old able-bodied bloke. I can't travel independently anymore, and maintaining my business life is proving increasingly difficult. So, we're heading for retirement. Like many of the accused here, and that was his word, not mine, I've got a self-managed super fund, and I consulted with my accountant last week and will probably be wrapping up my business next year as I turn 60 in October. And, of course, you're all welcome to my birthday at the Tathra pub, but that was his comment. By the way, I'm sure if you make an investigation, you might be able to find out about it. But these are the people who are the victims of removing refundable franking credits. I literally have hundreds of them. And they're not people confected. They're not people who just send in pro forma submissions. They're real Australians who have come to voice their concern. And, as I said, some of the concerns that people have raised has been not just why they're being discriminated against, why they're being targeted, why there hasn't been a focus on comprehensive tax reform, but also concern, quite legitimately amongst the Australian community, about what is being done to deal with multinational tax avoidance and investor avoidance, as well as large company tax avoidance, and why that isn't being focused on. Now, of course, we actually know that this government has quite a proud record of doing so. At the start of this term, we introduced a series of measures to close loopholes and put up extra obligations on multinational companies who do business in Australia, who shift their assets and investments overseas and minimise their tax obligation. Now, this presents us, Deputy Speaker, with a whole host of challenges around competitiveness, of which tax is an important part. It's sort of it blows me away that some members of the opposition don't seem to really understand that competitiveness in the tax system in a global economy is important. And therefore, the only solution, and I said in my first speech, I've said it 100 times in this House before, and I'll continue to say it, and I don't care whether it conflicts or is consistent with government policy, we need wholesale tax reform. And we need a rebasing of the tax system, not just about who's paying tax, it's at what stages of life, and, of course, it's about making sure that people can't find ways to avoid it. There's an excellent book on this by a fellow by the name of Charles Murray called For Good and Evil, the Role of Tax and the Rise and Fall of Civilization. I'll buy you a copy if you want, Deputy Speaker, not to influence, but because it's actually genuinely a good read. It looks at the history of tax and tax reform, or sorry, actually more correctly, the failure of tax reform, and how bad tax systems become worse, and how they actually dramatically undermine the structure of a society and an economy. And, of course, there are a number of lessons out of the thesis that's been done looking at historical examples. And what does it say? Taxes should generally be low, so people don't want to avoid them. Taxes should be simple, to remove the opportunity that can be exploited. And, of course, it's to make sure that as many people pay tax as possible. This is a point, of course, that the former Treasurer Peter Costello regularly made, where he always talked about the failure of different ways, particularly the opposition, when they were in government, tried to approach tax where they would try and minimise the number of people paying tax and maximise the number of people who were relieved of tax obligations. Now, I make no apology, Deputy Speaker. I fundamentally believe that everybody should pay at least some contribution towards the tax system. If you can take out of it, you should be expected to contribute to it. Everybody should have an equal investment in society. Everybody should have a want to perpetuate it. Everybody should expect a sense of responsibility for the country that we live in and cherish and love, and should not be able to avoid that responsibility. And that includes multinationals who take advantage and seek opportunity in this country. I think it's an utterly fair and consistent approach. And what we need to do is make sure that people can't take advantage of the tax system to take advantage of Australians. And, of course, in the end, the only way that's truly achieved, to be contrarian, is to look at things like broad-based tax reform, and particularly consumption-based taxes, where people, or companies more correctly, find it more difficult to avoid, rather than simply trying to focus energy and resources in having an extremely complicated, unnecessarily complicated tax system. I am, Deputy Speaker, I don't want it to be taken away that I'm some sort of deserter running off and supporting New Zealand, but their tax system is a lot simpler than ours, and I have to say, it has a few strengths too. So what have we got before us? Some bills to at least close some loopholes, to start to address some of those challenges around tax reform for Australia, to minimise the opportunity for companies to take advantage of Australia and take revenue offshore left unchecked. And we have a number of proposals within the piece of legislation, in which all, I think most the members, despite them making an amendment, agree with the broad principles. Stops double gearing so foreign investors can't shift profits to avoid tax. Tick. Stop foreign investors getting tax concessions on stapled structures to achieve tax rates of 15% or less, or in some cases almost tax-free, on Australian business income. Tick. Taxes foreign investors' income from Australian agricultural land and Australian residential property other than affordable housing and managed investment trusts at the top corporate tax rate. Tick. Provides transition periods of up to 15 years for existing investments, and that's critical, of course, if we want to continue to be an attractive destination for capital, so that we can create the job opportunities for the next generation of Australians. And that allows for a 15-year concessional rate for investments in new nationally significant infrastructure as determined by the Treasurer, and implements the government budget commitment to support affordable rental housing by providing a 15% tax rate as well. So all of the measures are good. All the measures are critical. And the final point I want to pick up on, and it's one that the previous speaker raised as well, is that more than anything else what we need to do is drive investment into the housing market. Housing affordability is one of the most foundational principles in which a healthy society prospers. Yes, all right, it creates jobs, and that's very important. But as Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, made the observation, one of the great lessons of the French Revolution is if people don't have an investment in society, they will not seek to conserve the status quo. And he's right. We should want every Australian to own their own home, or aspire to own their own home, and to be in a position to secure so. And this government's done quite a lot in making sure through housing agreements we can help that pathway on its way. I know the opposition's got policies too, and they're welcome to it. And I at least appreciate the fact that they've got an appreciation for the challenge and the issue. But this requires a whole-of-government, whole-of-nation response, because it is in the best interests of the country. You'll hear me say this time and time again, Deputy Speaker, and I say it for deeply philosophical, committed reasons.